Welcome to this installation video on Sitecore Speedy with the latest versions for the Sitecore 10 upgrade. So with this release of Speedy version for Sitecore version 10, we look at removing the critical NPM node package integration altogether, and we're simply hooking into the SXA pipeline to download the entire CSS bundle. This is a result of feedback we received from those using Speedy that content editors simply don't want to regenerate the critical CSS and look after that side of things. So we're just this release is all about simplification of the whole setup process and simplifying installation so that anyone can get up and running quite easily. So before we kick off showing the package installation and subsequent field usage, let's have a look at how we're baselining our scores with the Habitat demo installed on Sitecore 10. Now I've taken the Habitat demo one step further with some basic improvements such as gzipping my HTML payload. I've got WebP image compression going on and image lazy loading on that homepage. So let's have a look at those in action and we'll get a basic score after that. So if I look at my network tab, you'll see that my initial HTML payload is gzipped up, and that makes a significant difference to the overall size of that page that we're downloading. And at this stage, it's 15.5 KB, and so that's quite small. Now that's going to grow significantly, as you'll see after we install the Speedy module, because we're going to start to inline some of our assets to remove some of those network penalties that we incur for downloading individual CSS and JavaScript files that are treated as external files. Taking a look in our image network tab, we can see that the bulk of the images on that page, in fact all of them except the SVG, have been done in WebP compression, and the overall image payload is 851 KB. Now, WebP delivers around a 20 to 35% improvement. I think that's roughly the figures. If you've done your standard JPEG compression already, so if you haven't quite compressed your images to, or your JPEGs or GIFs to what would be optimal, then you're going to get even bigger gains on top of that. So just pointing out that WebP is probably the image compression you want to use at this point to get those page speed scores nice and high. So that's gzip, I've got WebP, and then I've got my lazy loading also happening on the home page, which defers the bulk of the image payload. So I've done this fairly aggressively, as you can see. As you scroll down the page, those images come into view. Great, so let's get a baseline score. So that's the SXA Habitat demo site with gzip, WebP, and lazy loading added to the homepage, just to take care of some of those low-hanging fruit for page speed. And what am I getting in terms of a page speed score? 56 and 86 on desktop. So the mobile is the one we care about. For any of these tests, when running them, we generally want to do them about 5 times, as that score does fluctuate with different variables. So I always run a few tests on each one. Just to show you that score does fluctuate, let's have a look at that again. Okay, 65. So with Habitat out of the box, without those improvements that I've just laid on there, probably looking at around the 50 out of 100 mark for mobile. Okay, so we've looked at the current page speed score. Yeah, just to point out that I'm on a fairly low spec VM at the moment. So some of these scores you will tend to see that I'm getting a time till first byte penalty, or that the server's taking a long time to respond. That's just to note this is a fairly low spec VM. All right, now onto the Speedy installation. So Once you've grabbed the Speedy Sitecore package, we can go in and start to install that using the installation wizard. So I'm going to choose my package. There it is there. I'm going to go next, and you can simply go ahead and click next again and install. Now there should be one pop-up that comes up, and our default preference will be to override. So what we're doing here is simply setting on the default SXA page template that it will inherit from the Speedy template, so that the Speedy options are available on each page. So I'm going to go ahead and overwrite on that one. You could also do that step manually if you didn't want to override that particular template. Great, and then I'll go ahead and restart the client as well. Okay, the next step in the installation process. So this is really a three-step process. You install the package, we change the layout of the page we want to enable Speedy on. So switch it from the MVC layout to our MVC layout page speed. That's all done. And now we scroll down to our Speedy section. So out of the box, the enable Speedy for this page won't be checked. It's up to you to check that box. And we'll run through all these particular fields soon and the global settings for Speedy as well. But let's check that and go ahead and, okay, ignore the unicorn for now and go ahead and we'll have a look at our page speed and now the structure that that out of the box Speedy settings is producing for us. Now on the first page load of the upgraded Speedy module, there's a slight performance penalty. We're reading in a lot of external files and putting them in line for this one. There is caching in the background, so on the next user that does load the Speedy module, that will be significantly faster, as we've just seen there. And we'll go ahead and have a look at the HTML structure that that's producing. So right at the top is all the lazy loading code. That's the same as before. That hasn't changed with Speedy. We come down to where we're deferring the load of our JavaScript files. Now for this version of Speedy, we're loading them slightly differently depending on the device screen size. So for those mobile devices, we're deferring the JavaScript for a little bit longer and we're adding in a loader by default. For the desktop devices, we're letting those JavaScript files load in straight away. And this is simply to accommodate the way that the Lighthouse algorithm works and recognize that for desktop devices, you do have higher bandwidths going on, so you can do that the bulk of the JavaScript almost immediately. Whereas on mobile devices, Lighthouse does give us a better score if we defer the bulk of that JavaScript payload until after a page load event or a certain amount of time, which is generally around that 5 to 8 second mark. It's all our loading code, some settings. We've got some vanilla JavaScript that simply does our loader for mobile, and we'll cover off how that can be customized. You can remove that completely via the fields built in. And then we've got quite a large block of the critical CSS. So depending on how you set that up, you can also cut that down a bit. But that's essentially all the CSS files that would otherwise be network blocking are now put in line into the critical area of the page. Continuing on to the bottom. So we're no longer deferring the CSS asset load and putting them onto the page at the bottom and injecting them dynamically because you have all the CSS in the critical region. What we are doing is telling the browser to prefetch all the assets, JavaScript and CSS, for subsequent page visits. So for navigation items that you click on, you go to the next page. We're already telling the browser to get those ready before we go to those pages. Speed is installed. I will show you the mobile loader as well. Once our loader completes loading in the background, it detects all the JavaScript that's been deferred, and our images come into view as we scroll down. Interactivity is all available at that point, as the page and the JavaScript is ready to go, so to speak. And possibly there's a small bug with the carousel there, but we'll continue on with the installation demo, so I think you get the point. Great, so we've got Speedy all set up. Let's jump over to Google PageSpeed Insights and we'll just get some scores. Cool, so a score of 90 out of 100 first up, and you'll notice that yeah, I am getting hit with a basically initial server response time. It's too slow, mainly due to my under spec VM, I can assume on that one. Really, you want that to be under 0.2 seconds in order not to get any penalty hit from the Lighthouse algorithm. So on a production server, you'd want that to be quite a bit quicker and have your rendering caches all set up so that your server's really serving the majority of the page from memory and not hitting any of the Sitecore databases. But on second page load, a much better response time. Hopefully more of my pages made it into the cache by that point. And we'll do, so 100 on desktop, mobile. So you can see my mobile loader does show up in the timeline there. And on the desktop, because we're not doing the mobile loader or any of the deferred actions, the actual timeline shows up a lot earlier. Let's do one more for good luck. Bang, so hang in there right about that 99 mark. And on that one, I didn't get any initial server response time penalty. Jumping back now into the CMS. Okay, in Sitecore now, let's quickly go over all the fields that Speedy gives you, and we'll wrap up the video after that. So obviously enabling Speedy on a per page basis. This is the first of the feature toggles, and that is the overall on and off switch, if you like, for that particular page. So it's just the home page at this point. You can also turn off just the style sheet deferral or just the JavaScript deferral. So in the case of this one, you're turning on or off the critical CSS. If that's unticked, then style sheets will load as render blocking assets as they normally would, I guess in old school loading terms. If you disable the JavaScript defer, then in the same case, we will no longer dynamically inject JavaScript, and the mobile loader and all those sorts of things, we'll turn those off, and JavaScript files will render normally as they would without these techniques. And then next we have our cookie detection. So you can use cookies to detect if these Speedy techniques should be used on just the first page load. And so subsequent visits or secondary page loads will use that cookie to say, hey, this user's already got all the style sheets and all the JavaScript in their browser cache. We don't really need to do the style sheet or the critical CSS and JavaScript deferral on that secondary page load in that particular case. So we just use the normal page load techniques, and Speed is ignored by that cookie. So special case CSS, this essentially allows us to style up the loader, but you could in fact put any other CSS that you need to, any other important CSS that you might find you need based on some sort of issues with rendering that entire critical block at the top of the page. So in previous versions of Speedy, we used this for addressing flashing fonts and slightly shifting layouts. And the same thing applies. You can basically put any sort of CSS that you need to inline for the page in that particular block. The CSS that comes with the V10 demo is simply that that mobile loader that we showed you just a moment ago. So those CSS fallback selectors, it's documented on how exactly to use these on the Speedy GitHub. So basically the display unset selector it will hide any of the items those CSS selectors refer to until the JavaScript is loaded. So we hide it at first using the display unset, and then once the JavaScript has loaded, we set it to display block. Those items that these CSS selectors are referring to will then show on the page. For mobile JavaScript support, so this is a vanilla, a block of vanilla JavaScript that is dropped in line on the page. For this particular example, we've got the mobile loader, vanilla JavaScript, and that's just a section of JavaScript that we showed a bit earlier that basically controls the loading of that mobile loader. For every other page load, you can leave this field empty if you like. It's also an opportunity to inject another vanilla JavaScript file, and in my particular case, I've set my lazy loading JavaScript in there to be done on each page load. So this particular block of JavaScript will be rendered on first and secondary page load visits. It's not controlled by or not switched off by the use cookies to detect if Speedy is required, basically. And those are the page level settings. So the other settings that you can deal with are available under System Settings and Foundation, Speedy, so the Speedy Global Settings. These settings allow you to impact the cookie declaration set to, and that's the cookie that controls whether we just do the Speedy techniques on first or secondary page loads. You can control how long you're deferring your JavaScript for, how long you're deferring your CSS for, how long you're deferring the fallback experience for. So that controls when those items that you might have shown and hidden on page load, that controls how long until they will be basically displayed back on the page. And then you can also enable a debug mode, and what this does is turn off any of those background caches that we use to build up the critical CSS on the page or the deferred JavaScript asset lists and CSS lists. So it allows you to turn off any of the caches in the background so that you can basically debug the C# essentially and see how the code is generating those items. Now the last set of fields that might interest you are the global speed filters. This allows us to select which particular CSS file we want to filter out. So this is basically applying filters to that large block of critical CSS at the top of the page so that we can try to cut that down. So we specify which file we would like to remove something from. It's JSON, so probably best just to copy and use these examples for any other filters that you want to build. So we specify a list of filters, and it's basically a find and replace. So we specify the start string that would find within that file and the end string that would be used to cut all the contents out from the very start character, from this character, up until the very start of this particular string. So it'll cut everything out from essentially \* up until just before this \* and then we do another one. So for this one, we're cutting out the whole font awesome block, and for this one, we're cutting out the whole calendar block of CSS because The font awesome block was actually repeated a number of times throughout a lot of the theme files, and the full calendar, we simply don't need that on the homepage. So in that way, we can use our filters to reduce the size of that critical CSS block shown on the homepage. And once again, we've got fairly heavy caching around these filters, so they don't run every time. Once your critical CSS gets into cache, it's simply going to be stored in memory so that we can speed up that page load and processing on subsequent visits for every other user that comes after that very first, I guess, server start. And that wraps up the overview of installing Speedy for V10 and some of the fields